In more than 20 years of observing this pattern, I have seen people with an avoidant attachment style step away from relationships that, from the outside, would look almost ideal. Relationships where there is patience, emotional stability, genuine care, and a level of devotion that many people spend years trying to find. I have seen avoidant individuals pull back from partners who are not overwhelming, not demanding, not chaotic, but instead calm, consistent, emotionally aware, and deeply considerate. People who knew how to give space when it was needed, who did not chase, who did not pressure, and who offered love in a steady, grounded way that should have felt safe. And yet, even in those conditions, the pattern still repeats. The avoidant begins to withdraw, not always loudly. Sometimes it happens quietly through reduced communication, emotional distancing, and an increasing sense of internal separation while still physically present. To an outside observer, it can feel confusing because nothing bad is happening in the obvious sense. In fact, everything may appear healthy, and still, something inside the avoidant system begins to shut down the closeness. But what I have also witnessed repeatedly and consistently is something else that complicates this pattern. There are rare moments when the same type of person who typically disengages from emotional intimacy encounters someone specific, and the usual defenses do not function in the same predictable way. It does not always create a perfect relationship. It does not guarantee permanence or emotional resolution, but it does create a level of internal disruption that is far deeper than what most people ever manage to trigger. And what I want to explain is the nature of that person. Because it is not who most people assume it is. It is not the individual who loves with maximum intensity. It is not the one who gives endlessly, sacrifices everything, or bends themselves into emotional flexibility just to maintain closeness. It is not even the person who is endlessly patient, endlessly understanding, or endlessly forgiving. Those traits, while often praised, tend to activate something very specific in the avoidant nervous system: pressure. Even if no pressure is verbally expressed, emotional need can still be felt. And for someone with avoidant conditioning, perceived emotional demand, no matter how gentle, can register internally as a loss of autonomy. So instead of creating closeness, that kind of love often produces distance. Not because it is wrong, but because it is experienced as something that quietly asks to be carried. The type of empath who actually reaches deeper into the avoidant structure is very different. This person carries what can only be described as a grounded emotional sovereignty. They feel deeply, far more deeply than they often show, but they are not ruled by what they feel. Their emotional world is rich, sensitive, and highly perceptive. They notice tone shifts, energy changes, silence, hesitation, and emotional inconsistencies with almost intuitive accuracy. It is as if they can sense what is happening beneath the surface without needing it to be spoken. But here is the key difference. They do not lose themselves inside that perception. They do not collapse into anxiety when they sense distance. They do not abandon themselves to chase clarity. They do not reshape their identity in order to secure closeness. Their emotional depth exists, but it is contained within a strong internal structure. It has been shaped by experience, reflection, and often through periods of emotional hardship that forced them to learn how to sit inside their own inner world without falling apart. Because of that, their sensitivity is not fragile. It is stable. They can love someone without needing that person to stabilize them in return. They can feel connection without turning it into dependency. They can miss someone without immediately trying to repair that feeling through pursuit or reassurance seeking. And this is where the dynamic shifts in a way that feels almost paradoxical to the avoidant mind. For the avoidant, emotional distance is usually a form of safety. It creates control. It reduces vulnerability. It allows them to regulate intimacy by stepping back whenever things feel too close, too fast, or too emotionally demanding. But when they encounter someone who is emotionally deep without being emotionally dependent, something unfamiliar happens. They are met by presence that does not chase them, yet does not disappear either. They are met by warmth that is real but not clingy, affection that is available but not consuming, interest that is genuine but not desperate. This kind of person does not demand emotional access. They simply exist in their own emotional wholeness while allowing connection to be optional, not compulsory. And that is what begins to penetrate the avoidant defenses. Because there is nothing to push away in the usual sense. There is no emotional pressure to escape from. There is no collapse of self that forces withdrawal as a form of relief. Instead, what the avoidant encounters is something much more unsettling for them internally. A connection that remains present without trying to control proximity. They may still withdraw. They may still test distance. They may still fall into their familiar cycles. But underneath that behavior, something different begins to form. A kind of awareness that this person is not easily replaced, not because they are chasing significance, but because they are not offering a version of love that is easy to categorize or control. This empath does not need the avoidant to be whole. And paradoxically, that is exactly what makes them felt so deeply. They want them. Yes, genuinely. There is warmth, attraction, and emotional resonance. But that wanting is not built on lack. It is not built on emotional emptiness. It does not come from a place of, you complete me, but rather from, I choose to experience you. And that difference changes everything in the emotional field between them. Because for the avoidant, what is most difficult to process is not intensity, but stability combined with emotional freedom. Someone who can care without clinging. Someone who can stay connected without losing themselves. Someone who can feel deeply without making that feeling a demand. This is why such an empath does not just enter the avoidant's life, they enter their internal awareness. They leave an imprint that does not disappear easily, even when distance returns, even when silence takes over, even when the relationship does not fully form or sustain in the way either person might have unconsciously hoped, because what was experienced was not pressure and not pursuit, but presence. And presence like that is not something the avoidant mind easily forgets. But their openness is never dependent on whether the avoidant responds in the same way. And that single distinction, this quiet psychological independence existing alongside deep emotional availability, is exactly what the avoidant system has no clear strategy for. Here is the reason. The avoidant withdrawal pattern was built to respond to a very specific kind of relational pressure. It activates when there is visible emotional need in front of them, when someone's sense of stability, reassurance, or self-worth appears to be directly tied to how engaged the avoidant is being in that moment. In those dynamics, when the avoidant pulls away, the other person typically reaches. And when the other person reaches, the avoidant moves further back. It becomes a loop. Distance creates more distance. Pursuit intensifies withdrawal. And over time, the pattern reinforces itself until it becomes exhausting for both people involved. But the sovereign empath does not follow that loop. When they sense distance, they do not instinctively move forward to close the gap. Not because they are numb to it. In fact, they often feel it very deeply, sometimes even more sharply than others would. But their response does not move outward into pursuit. It moves inward into regulation, into reflection, into self-support, into reconnecting with their own emotional center rather than outsourcing stability to the other person. They return to themselves instead of chasing reassurance. And because of that, something fundamental in the avoidance system stops functioning in its usual way. The withdrawal response no longer produces its familiar effect. There is no escalation to push against, no visible emotional urgency to regulate by creating distance, no sense of being needed in a way that allows the avoidant to position themselves as the less emotionally entangled party. The entire structure that normally sustains the cycle loses its friction. Instead, what remains is stillness. And that stillness is unfamiliar, because on the other side of the avoidance retreat, there is no pursuit, there is no collapse, there is no emotional bargaining. There is no subtle pressure disguised as patience. There is simply a person who is still there in their own way, present, grounded, internally steady, but not reaching. This is where the avoidance system begins to lose its usual reference points. There is nothing to reject in order to feel autonomous. No emotional intensity to step away from in order to regain clarity. no neediness to contrast themselves against in order to reaffirm their independence. The psychological environment they are used to navigating no longer exists in the same form, and in its place is something far more difficult for them to categorize, a connection that does not demand proximity in order to exist. That kind of presence is disorienting for the avoidant, not because it is overwhelming, but because it is self-contained. It does not try to pull them closer, but it also does not fall apart when they step back. And I want to be precise here about what creates that effect. This empath does not see the avoidant through distortion. They do not reduce them to an idealized figure, nor do they project a fixed future version of who they might become once healed. They are not operating from fantasy or emotional bargaining. They see the full reality, the contradictions, the depth, the moments of genuine connection that feel almost undeniable in their intensity. And alongside that, the equally real patterns of withdrawal, avoidance, emotional inconsistency, and relational distance. Nothing is edited out, nothing is exaggerated, and nothing is excused. What they hold is clarity without distortion, and emotional openness without dependency. And that combination is what changes the entire relational field. They perceive everything, fully and directly, without slipping into either idealization or resentment. And what they hold in that perception is a form of compassionate clarity that is extremely uncommon. For an avoidant person who has usually experienced relationships in two predictable phases, either being placed on a pedestal or eventually being met with frustration and emotional withdrawal, this is unfamiliar territory. In most of their relational history, they are either overvalued in a way that feels unrealistic or later devalued in a way that feels condemning. Sometimes both in sequence. What they rarely encounter is someone who can see them accurately without distortion and still remain steady in how they relate to them. And when that happens, something subtle but powerful shifts, because being seen clearly without judgment by someone who does not use that clarity as a reason to withdraw, attack, or disappear disrupts the avoidant's entire internal logic. The defensive structure they rely on was built for relationships where clarity eventually turns into pressure, criticism, or emotional demand. It was also built for relationships where emotional intensity eventually collapses into anger or rejection. But when none of that follows, when clarity is met with calm presence instead of escalation, the structure has nothing solid to justify itself against. There is no threat to escape from, no emotional demand to resist, no punishment waiting on the other side of closeness. And so the wall loses its purpose in that moment, even if it still physically remains in place. This empath also does something even more decisive in bypassing the avoidant system, and it is something worth naming clearly. They do not try to change the avoidant. This may sound simple on the surface, but in practice, it is rare. Because even when people believe they are being patient, accepting, or emotionally respectful, there is often an underlying expectation of eventual change, a quiet narrative that says, if I stay consistent enough, understanding enough, emotionally safe enough, then over time this person will open, soften, and become more available. That expectation may never be spoken, but it is often felt, and avoidant individuals are highly sensitive to it. Even subtle emotional expectation can register internally as pressure, not because it is aggressive, but because it implies direction, movement toward becoming someone other than who they currently are. The sovereign empath does not carry that internal contract. Their presence is not a holding space for transformation. It is not a pause before improvement. It is not an emotional waiting room for a future version of the relationship. It is simply presence, offered without conditions, without hidden timelines, without an unspoken requirement for emotional evolution. And that absence of agenda is what makes the experience so disarming for the avoidant psyche. Because it is not trying to pull anything from them, it is not trying to shape them, it is not trying to resolve them, it simply meets them as they are. And for someone who has spent much of their relational life anticipating either demands or disappointment, that kind of unpressured presence is deeply unfamiliar at a level that is difficult to articulate. It bypasses thinking. It goes beneath interpretation. It lands somewhere quieter than language, where defenses are not actively decided, but simply no longer necessary in the same way. And that is why, even when avoidant patterns remain intact, something in them is altered by the experience. Not always outwardly visible, not always immediately integrated, but internally registered in a lasting way, because what they encountered was not pursuit and not rejection, but clarity without condemnation and closeness without captivity. And that combination is rare enough to be unforgettable. And if what I have described resonates with your own inner experience, this blend of emotional depth, clarity, and grounded sensitivity, then there is something important to recognize in it. That capacity was never excessive. It was never misaligned. It was never the problem. It simply requires a level of relational maturity on the other side that is not always present at the same time. Not because it is impossible, but because timing, readiness, and emotional capacity rarely develop evenly between two people at once. In conclusion, what ultimately disrupts the avoidant pattern is not intensity, not pursuit, and not emotional sacrifice, but the rare presence of someone who can remain deeply open while staying internally grounded and self-contained. When emotional clarity is met without judgment and closeness is offered without pressure or hidden expectation, the usual defensive cycles begin to lose their structure. The push and pull that normally defines these dynamics cannot fully take shape when one person does not chase, does not collapse, and does not turn distance into emotional desperation. Instead, what remains is a different kind of experience, one rooted in presence, not pursuit. A connection that does not demand control, does not enforce change, and does not punish distance, yet still carries genuine emotional depth. And while this does not guarantee resolution or permanence, it does leave a lasting imprint, because it introduces something the avoidance system rarely encounters: closeness without captivity and understanding without distortion. This dynamic is not about fixing anyone. It is about the rare moment when two psychological realities meet without force, one learning that it does not have to chase, and the other discovering that it does not have to run. And in that brief space of balance, something quietly shifts that neither side fully forgets.